evening, everyone. My name is Elisa Finston, and I'm the Senior Vice President of Community Engagement at the Jewish Federation of Greater Los Angeles. Welcome to our program tonight, The Asian American Experience, the Model Minority Myth and Anti-Asian Hate. It is a pleasure to welcome all of you. We have a great crowd this evening of so many people from across many sectors and communities in our city. We are grateful to have built a strong working relationship with Faith and Community Empowerment, FACE, and we are proud to partner with them on this evening tonight. I want to note that this program is being held during both Jewish American Heritage Month and Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, both which are celebrated in May. And I also, of course, want to acknowledge that our hearts go out to everyone in Israel and everyone who is a victim of the violence in the Middle East. We pray for a speedy recovery of the injured and grieve the loss of life over the last few days. We continue to monitor the situation and support those in need, and also pray that this fighting and terror will end soon. In and beyond the civic space, our federation always identifies and addresses our community's most significant challenges and opportunities. In response to the pandemic, the Federation helped our community through a series of quick, strategic, and large-scale efforts that cared for those in need, supported families to help stay connected to Jewish life, and secured our community institutions. And tonight's program is one of the many our Federation's Community Engagement Strategic Initiative has provided to the community during the pandemic to help people keep connected to communities throughout Los Angeles and understand critical issues facing our neighbors. Many of you know that our Federation is the leading member of JPAC, the Jewish Public Affairs Committee of California, a statewide advocacy organization. In fact, just before this event, we concluded our annual Advocacy Day, where we spoke directly to state legislators on issues of importance to the Jewish community and beyond. This year, we advocated on a package of legislation and budget items dealing with hate crimes. This critical legislation, if passed, will allow for better tracking and reporting of hate crimes, as well as establish the California State of Hate Commission to help the state be aware of, address, and hopefully reduce instances of hate crimes. This legislation is critical to not only the Jewish community, but extends to other communities, including the AAPI community, experiencing hatred and violence. And we hope we can all come together to advocate on this issue and others of mutual concern. We also work closely with the Jewish Federations of North America on advocacy of relevant legislation at the federal level, and our federation joined with many other organizations in calling on lawmakers to provide the tools needed to address the threat of anti-Semitism, rising hate crimes against Asian American and Pacific Islanders, and the urgent need to protect all at-risk communities through the swift passage of the bipartisan No Hate Act of 2021. So as you can see, it is a priority for the Federation to build relationships and community and work in partnership with diverse groups across our region. And it is especially meaningful to be here in partnership with my friend, Hapen Im, the President and CEO of Faith and Community Empowerment, FACE. It's honored for me to welcome Hapen onto this virtual stage with me. Hi.
Hi.
So established in 2001, FACE is a national nonprofit involved in empowering churches and nonprofits to leverage their resources by building capacity, leadership, and partnerships in economic development and serving as a bridge between the Korean and Asian American community and the greater community at large. Hapen, I want to begin by saying to you that the Federation stands in solidarity with the Asian American community, and we hold in our hearts all victims of hate. Acts of hate show that moments like tonight are critical as we work together to have a deeper understanding and respect for each other. Hapen, the Federation first met you 8 years ago, if you can believe that, when you traveled to Israel with us on our annual Community Leaders Mission. We have been fortunate to take many trips with LA influential leaders, including Hapen, where we developed strong, lasting connections. And that trip was really the beginning of a beautiful friendship between our organizations. And while this trip happened before I arrived at the Federation, The relationship built by my predecessors was so strong that it was one of the first ones that I engaged in when I arrived. And in 2017, Hapen invited me to join her planning committee for her program commemorating the 25th anniversary of the '92 LA riots. We've also done community service together, and Federation volunteers even worked with FACE during the pandemic, I believe, to deliver meals. Hapen has offered her time and expertise as a speaker to our Rautenberg New Leaders Project cohorts, which is our civic engagement leadership program for young adults. And she has personally given our cohorts tours of Koreatown during our sessions and educated our cohort on issues facing the LA Korean community. Hapen also participated with us in a new program we created before COVID called Lunches with Leaders, where we brought together leaders from across Los Angeles to break bread together. And of course, we see each other around at many civic engagement programs in LA, and I look forward to seeing you again in person. And after recent months and the attacks on the Asian American community, it was clear to us that we wanted to bring together our community to hear Hapen from you and others and learn firsthand how this time has been for you, dismantle biases towards Asian Americans, and learn, most importantly, how we can be the strongest allies possible. So, I really appreciated the time getting to know you on our bi-weekly planning calls for this program. Feel like I've learned more about you and your organization, and I want our audience to know about you too and your experience. So can you just start by sharing a little bit with us what it's been like for you, the last year, the last few months, and how you and your community are doing?
Well, I think like all people during the pandemic, starting off, you're trying to figure out just how to pivot. But I think that with the continued connections of the pandemic related to China virus and Kung Fu virus, there was immediately impact in our community, not just Chinese community, but even in the Korean community. Some of the Korean restaurants were, there were false rumors spreading that some Korean airlines flight attendants had visited and they got sick, and so suddenly all the restaurants started to close as well. But I have to say that the ongoing attacks, even with the passage at the federal level, has not mitigated. And the Atlanta massacre, I think, was a turning point in some ways for our community in terms of the fact that the world, and particularly America, including not just policymakers, but other communities of color, started to recognize that the Asian community for so long, not just in the 6,600 reports, from March of last year to this year, but just really historically that we have faced discrimination, racism, and that we suffer from a lot of the issues that impact other communities of color. So actually, on that note, as horrific as it was, and it was infuriating when the police officer took on the narrative of the perpetrator and put the victims into this category of dubious business, and that it just was, again, infuriating that it's not looked upon as a hate crime. So there was a lot of that and anger, particularly the attack on women, Asian women whose bodies historically, again, have been fetishized and just used and abused in so many ways. But I have to say that on a positive note, I've been so inspired that the friendships that we had developed over the years, particularly as a lesson from the LA riots, where over $1 billion in property damage, over 40% were incurred by Koreans, 2,300 businesses destroyed. But when we were kicked down and crying, my question was, why weren't there others there to cry with us? And they say that it's too late to make friends when you need them. And I feel that the Jewish community has played such a big role in terms of really developing authentic relationships. And my hat's off to you. I work with various communities, but I'm very grateful. I was very inspired, heartwarmed, in terms of so many communities, especially there's some historic tension between Black and Korean / Black and Asian community, but so many of them use their social media platform to speak out, push back the narrative. And at the same time, you and Mary reached out to me. And I was so grateful to, when you say, what can we do together? What can we do to help you? And I thought that was just very consistent with your past commitment to, again, really reaching out and developing, strengthening authentic relationships as well. The last piece is that I'm very proud of the Asian American community. Even for myself, I have to say that I'm not shy in speaking rooms like this, but on social media, I hesitate because you could quickly go down a rabbit hole and you can't carry a nuanced conversation. But because of voices like yourself and others who've used their social media platform to come in defense and push back those narratives, that I am starting to learn to reclaim my voice, where for so long we've been told, we've been silenced, and we've been told our voices don't matter, but to really reclaim my voice so that I could be a voice not just for our community, but for others as well. And so in that way, I step with the voices of so many other Asian Americans who have also stepped up from where we've begun.
That's great. Well, we stand with you and we cry with you, and we want to be joyous with you as well. So I know we have a lot of other speakers that are going to join us in a few minutes, but I have one question that I want to make sure is covered. And I want everyone, I know this is going to be asked of the rest of our panelists as well, but I think it's important for those joining us to hear, how can we be the best allies to you?
Thank you for that. I think, first of all, in all your talking points, especially around racial equity and fight, that when you are inviting communities of color, that there's a checklist to say, where are the Asians? Because forever, we are consistently left out because of the model minority myth. We also ask you to use your platform to be a voice. And so when we are missing in the room, or in policies and funding, and speaker invites, to again use that voice, you have a very powerful voice and platform to say, where are the Asians? They should be included, especially because we're the second largest minority population in the state, in the county, and the city. But if you saw on stages or speakers or anywhere else, you wouldn't know that. So we ask for that. And then third is that if there are resources, our community is hurting. The pandemic has had a disproportionate impact, but just historically, that there are many, if you look and disaggregate many of the data points, you'll see that so many community members are hurting. And so to also invest in our community.
Great, wonderful. Well, I think you're going to introduce a special guest that we have who's joining us from Washington. So I'm going to let you do that. And I'm going to thank you once again. And I know we'll hear from you again after our special guest.
Thank you, Elisa. You've been a great friend. Thank you. With Mary.
Thank you.
At this time, it's my honor. This is the Asian American Heritage Month, and I learned something new. I didn't know that it was the Jewish Heritage Month as well. So happy celebration.
You too.
So it's my honor to introduce the next speaker, who I had the privilege to get to know when we were running our National Lighting the Community Summit in Washington, D.C. And we invited many federal speakers, including the White House. And at that time, Erica Morissugo was working actually as the Assistant Secretary for Congressional and Intergovernmental Relations at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. She right now works for President Biden through the advocacy of the Asian American community with support of their allies. A new position was created for the first time, and she serves now as a Deputy Assistant to the President and AAPI Senior Liaison, in which she is a voice and an advisor to the President and also building relations with the Asian American community. She has quite a diverse background. She has worked for a couple of senators, several federal agencies. She even worked for Anti-Defamation League, and her interest and her passion covers a whole diversity of areas. And so again, it is my honor to introduce our AAPI Liaison Deputy Assistant Erica Morissugo.
Aloha, y'all. My name is Erica Moritsugu. I appreciate you allowing me to make some remarks before your conversation today as part of Asian American and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. Thank you to Alyssa Finston at the Jewish Federation of Greater Los Angeles and our cherished Hapen Im at Faith and Community Empowerment for organizing this event, and to all of the speakers that are participating and sharing your experiences today. In my new role, I serve as the Deputy Assistant to the President and Asian American and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander Senior Liaison at the White House. I'm coming into this position at a time of persistent anti-Asian hate and violence, and during a pandemic that's taken a severe economic and personal toll on the AA and NHPI communities. Before joining the administration, I've had the privilege of leading a team at the Anti-Defamation League with excellent community engagement and interreligious professionals and lay leaders during some existentially terror-ridden and tragic experiences for the Jewish community. And through this work, I didn't just lead, I learned from the deep work that's been done and all that needs to be done going forward between and among all traditionally marginalized communities. To name and honor our differences and unique experiences, for sure, but also to be sure to name and honor our shared vision of a future of safety, tolerance, belonging, and opportunity for us all. This experience informs the work that it is my honor and responsibility to pursue now in the administration on behalf of the AA and NHPI communities. I'll work closely with the White House Office of Public Engagement to include the national organizations and with the White House Initiative on AAPIs that connects the AA and NHPI communities to the resources of the federal government. I've spent my entire life as a professional and as a volunteer, fighting for social justice and the empowerment of communities and individuals, and I will continue to do that in the White House with the confidence of a president who sees us and hears us and values us, and is committed to providing us with the safety and opportunity that we should expect and can now hope for. In response to the spike in anti-Asian hate and violence, the president acted quickly and resolutely in his first week in office by issuing a presidential memorandum condemning racism, xenophobia, and intolerance against the AA and NHPI communities. In March, he issued a fact sheet that showed further actions he's taken to combat hate and address health disparities for AA and NHPIs, including actions by the Department of Justice, Health and Human Services, and others. And you should know that the White House has begun having conversations with all segments of the AA and NHPI communities, and will work hand in hand with them to find solutions to the problems and challenges that are facing us today, and also find moments of joy and celebration to share with each other. I want to note that this is obviously not just Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. It is also Jewish American Heritage Month. The event you've organized today is so thoughtful in that it explores ways to strengthen our traditional and new coalitions in allyship and awareness between the Jewish American community and the AA and NHPI communities. It generates dialogue with each other about the unique perspectives that each community experiences. And this dialogue and support is something that we need more of as we continue to combat this hate and violence plaguing our society. As the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said in his famous quote, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." And to borrow a concept from the Hebrew word for friend, rabbis teach that the word chaver at its core means to attach, whether it is to share the burden with another person, to connect the two physical objects, or to manifest thoughts to words and paper. Although the community has had a difficult year of pain and fear, I want to also take this time today to recognize that Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders across our nation have a long history of achievement and perseverance. And I hope we can embrace the noble examples of leadership, resilience, and courage shown by the AA and NHPI communities, and recommit to the work that needs to be done to ensure safety, justice, equity, and opportunity for all of us to build towards Reverend Dr. King's vision of beloved community. And with that, mahalo nui loa, tararoba for the opportunity to join you today.
Thank you so much, Erica. So it is now my pleasure to introduce our moderator and speakers in addition to Hapen for the next part of the conversation. So Hapen, come back on the screen. You'll be able to find a full link to the bios in the chat. I don't want to say too much as I introduce because I want to get right to the conversation. So we're honored to have joining us Los Angeles City Council member John Lee, representing Council District 12 in neighborhoods in the North and West Valley. Welcome, Council member. We're also honored to have Jane Hong, an associate professor of history at Occidental College and a historian of U.S. immigration and engagement. And our moderator, Richard Louie, an anchor and journalist at MSNBC and NBC News. So now it's my pleasure to turn it over to Richard. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Alyssa. Really do appreciate it. It's great to be here, and these sorts of intersectional conversations, as we all understand, are very, very important. And hey, Pin, good to see you again, my good friend, as you do your great work. And in fact, I just came from Atlanta for 3 days, the past 3 days, and was in the house this morning of young AU. As you know, was one of the 8 victims, and her son let me into the home to show me the way she lived and the great life that she led. And we cannot forget these stories. And as we hit the 2-month mark this weekend of that attack, these are some of the events that energize us to work better together. And certainly her son, Bobby Peterson, is one of those voices. And he continues to talk about his mother in amazing, amazing ways. With such grace, he has embraced his new role. You know, hey, Pin, great introduction and a great start to the program. I want to start with Jane and the council member, because it's great to see you. Jane, how would you reflect on the last 3 months, the last month, the last year? What is it that we're going through?
I mean, I think it's just been, well, first, let me just say it's great to be part of the conversation. I mean, I think it's been a really challenging time for the community. As a person, I became a mom shortly before the pandemic began. So I know for women, for Asian American women, this has been an incredibly challenging time for many reasons. As a historian of the United States who focuses on Asian American communities, scholars, colleagues of mine, we've just been inundated with requests from the media, from all different kinds of conversations. And it's been incredibly encouraging in the sense that folks are taking an interest in Asian American histories to a degree we've never seen before. But it's unfortunate that this is the situation that has allowed that interest to bubble up. So I think we're just trying to, scholars like myself are just trying to educate and do what we can to contribute to the conversation.
Council member, good to connect with you. Thank you for that, Jane. I often say that our conversations that we have here are not for the 7% of Americans that happen to be Asian American Pacific Islander. It is for the 93%. Council member, how do you talk to the 93% to let them know this is what's happening right now?
Sure. You know, it's really about sharing our experience, the struggle of the Asian American experience, because that struggle is a struggle to belong in a country where no matter how long we've been here, many people still look at us as outsiders. Sadly, most Asian Americans are not surprised by the incidents of racism because most of us have lived our entire lives experiencing both overt and subtle racism. But one thing that is very different today is the level of fear. I mean, it's truly palpable. I mean, people like my mom are actually afraid to go out, and other people are afraid for their loved ones because of the sharp increase in violence that we've seen against Asian Americans over this last year. Asian Americans in this country have suffered a kind of collective trauma for over a century of being marginalized, dismissed. But one of the great things, and Hapin said this earlier, is that we're finding unity and our voice through our shared pain, which, you know, gives us all hope.
Big question, and you've discussed this in media, Jane. By the way, since we're talking about media, I'm a member of that thing, and so I kind of am very open, I am very open to all of you. Not, you know, if you want to interrupt and interject, please, by all means, be kind, but please do if you'd like to do that. There are no hard lanes in this conversation. You know, Jane, you've talked about it on air, and this is the question for many. Was it always happening? Or is this an upswing? Or is it both? Give us a historical context of what this is that we're going through right now.
I mean, yeah, that's the question that folks have been asking. I mean, I think it's really important to remember that this racialized violence, anti-Asian violence in particular, it's not new. It is getting more attention in the media, and there is, right, an increase in the number of incidents. So the severity, the frequency, these things are very much on the rise. So this is a particular moment, right? So I don't think we should downplay the severity and the frequency, but the targeting of Asian Americans due to their racial identity is not new. What's also not new, though, is what I have to say, is that Asian American resistance to racism and racial violence is also not new. And I really want to make sure that part of the conversation is highlighted, because sometimes so much of the focus is on the anti-Asian violence and not necessarily on Asian American communities and their resilience. So in terms of anti-Asian racism and racial violence, it's taken many forms over history. I mean, I study US immigration policy, and essentially for most of American history, immigration and naturalization law excluded Asians. So until the 1930s, or beginning really in the 19th century, many folks know about Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, but those exclusions actually were expanded to exclude all Asians from long-term immigration by the 1930s. And so those restrictions on immigration weren't actually lifted until 1965 in the 1965 Immigration Act. And the other piece of this story is naturalization or citizenship laws. For most of American history, Asians were racially barred from US citizenship. So until 1952, if you were born in Asia, if you were of Asian descent, you could not legally become a US citizen. The only exception were folks who were born in the United States, so second, third generation folks, but that was a much smaller number. So I mean, that history of exclusion is incredibly important to understanding how Asian Americans have been racialized. Because I think, what I think the council member, what Haypin referred to earlier, this kind of assumption that Asian Americans are somehow indelibly connected to Asia, right? That they're not necessarily American, right? That they're foreign in some way. I mean, that idea, the racialization of Asian Americans as un-American perpetual foreigners, many scholars argue that actually really begins, or it's reinforced by US laws, right? Kind of this history of structural racism. The last two things I'll say is, if you think about the history of anti-Asian violence, so I just talked about some of the violence in the law, right? Because I think that is a particular kind of violence. But in terms of, right, on the ground, interpersonal, individualized racism and racial violence, we know that the Chinese have been a target of violence since the 19th century. Los Angeles was the site of the 1871 Chinese massacre, which is one of the largest mass lynchings in US history. It's when a mob of 500 local white residents lynched 17 Chinese in Los Angeles. And no one was ultimately held accountable for those murders. We also know about World War II Japanese American incarceration, where 2/3 of the 120,000 folks who were incarcerated were US born citizens, right? Whose citizenship was diminished and didn't actually matter when it came down to their civil liberties. And the last two pieces, or the last piece I'll just mention, is more recently, when I talk about Asian American resistance, we have to mention the Asian American movement of the 1960s, which had a large kind of following here in Los Angeles, but also in the Bay Area, where Asian Americans came together and said, we're not just Chinese American, Japanese American, Korean American, Filipino American, but we actually are Asian American. And that has a political identity. It has a political kind of meaning, a significance, and that there is value in kind of collective Pan-Asian solidarity. And so I think that kind of Pan-Asian solidarity is very much still on the rise. And I think in part that's because when we think about anti-Asian violence today, even though the pandemic has really focused a lot of American sights on China, we know that non-Chinese Asian Americans have been targeted with this violence as well. So it doesn't just affect Chinese Americans, it affects all Asian Americans and really all people of color in the United States.
So those are great examples, or really not so great examples, right, Jane? In terms of answering that question of what are we going through right now? Council member, one of the things I think you and I do, maybe purposely or not purposely, implicitly or explicitly, is that we poke the bear, and we poke it wondering, can we just do what we want to do? You just want to, through politics, fix society? I just want to do news. But along the way, we have to own this thing, like we all do personally. But you're a person in the public, I am too, and I didn't get into news to do this thing, but I am doing it now.
Mhm.
For you, tell me about your journey.
Well, I got into politics because my parents both sort of faced that. My father, came to this country in 1958, felt that glass ceiling and was someone who, really pushed me and to tell me that, to effectuate real change, uh, that I only could do it from the inside. That was the best way that I can effectuate real change. And so, he really pushed me towards that. And, while I represented a district that's not predominantly Asian, uh, I still feel a sense of, not only is it my responsibility to represent my district, but being one of only 3 Asian Americans who've ever been elected to office in an area where really has one of the largest Asian populations in the city of Los Angeles, you do feel, like you said, um, feel that responsibility of making sure that Asian, voices are heard. But
Yeah.
not only that, it's just like it's pushing a lot of, it's not just legislation, which obviously is very important, but it's trying to, push other things like making sure that, Asians that when we're portrayed in the media, that we're not just caricatures. Anybody my age growing up, in the 80s, you had a love-hate relationship with the movie 16 Candles, right? You love the movie, but being in high school at the time, it was just, you knew what was going to come about from that, right? The caricature of someone coming from Asia, to this country was treated, really kind of as a joke. And, not having that positive role models is something that, I feel necessary that I need to speak up, even though that may not necessarily be, my avenue, like you said.
Mascot
about
council
that,
member is
so.
what you're talking about from 16 Candles, right? He was a mascot.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, I'm not cutting you off. Did I? If you're
No,
trucking,
no,
keep
no,
on
no,
moving.
no.
Okay.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. And you know what? I feel that like kind of what we were talking about earlier. It's a shame because growing up in a predominantly white area, I'm ashamed that I almost sort of rejected that part of me. I blame a large part of that of why I don't speak Korean, even though my parents spoke it in the house, because I so badly wanted to be accepted. And my best friend who's Italian American, his parents used to always say like, "Oh, John, we're proud to say we're Italian. Why do you always say American first?" I'm like, well, because you're accepted. You're accepted as being American, whereas I need to constantly have to reinforce that image that I am American, and my love for my cultural heritage and the love for the things that make me Korean does not diminish my love for this country or make me any less American.
Yeah, I did the same. And I laughed because when I joined CNN, I said, "Oh, if I don't pitch an Asian American story except for every 2 years, they won't pigeonhole me as the Asian guy." And then I had a conversation about 6 years later when I was over at MSNBC, where I'm still at, over at 30 Rock and NBC News. And a friend said, "Hey, Richard, just because you ain't pitching AAPI stories, this kind of gives it away, this thing." And I was like, you're right. I'm not so smart, I guess, not so sharp. But hey, Pin, you're smart and you're sharp, and you've got some more stuff to share with us. I'm going to give it back to you. And what do you have that really kind of brings it home for us? We're talking about this with words. You're going to do that too.
Well, so I think that one of the key reasons that the Asian community gets hurt in this country is because of the model minority myth. It robs us of solidarity with other communities of color, and at the same time robs us also of resources that could help advance our community. We are not white adjacent. We get none of that privilege. and at the same time, we don't get the benefits that are resources available to the community. And so over and over again, we have been working in this space to advocate, but it seems that the model minority myth is so embedded in people's mind that unless I show some data points, that they don't believe it. And even when I show the data points, a lot of times they second guess the data points itself. So I just want to do a quick run through of some of these places, right? So let me share my screen. Can you see my screen?
We can.
Okay, awesome. So,
All you.
all right,
Yes.
great. So, cannot there. So we have been, again, advocating at local, national levels, and most recently in a press conference with Vice President Kamala Harris, I was able to advocate the COVID impact on the Asian American community, as also as a voice for the faith community. So I think for many reasons, people think that we are the model minority, particularly because of the Times article in 1960s that really was set up to pit our community against other communities of color. But one main reason is that we do have one of the highest attainment level in terms of advanced degrees, right? Bachelor, master's, professional, doctorate, we shoot through the roof. But you would think that this would translate into promotion in the workplace. But sadly, it is not true. It's actually the opposite. In the private sector, we are likely at 55% of being promoted to management, African-American 65, Hispanic 74, white 111%. You look at university and federal government with discrimination laws, being more present, discrimination is less. And for Black and Hispanic, that is true. But you see for Asians, it actually goes the opposite direction at 40 and 30%. And you'll see that in terms of discrimination, again, the Asian community are, again, at similar or sometimes even higher levels at the home buying process. You'll see that Asians at the highest, even in the rental process, it is at a similar level as well. And if you look at home ownership rate and economics, you'll see that if you look to the left, white, Japanese, and Asian, like it seems like Asian is white adjacent. But if you actually disaggregate the data, if you go down the line, you'll see that for Hispanic is a little bit higher, and then Black is a little lower. And if you see right there, as a Korean American, we're at the same level as Black community. But if you were to just go by the aggregate data of Asian, you would not see that all these Asian communities who are actually even below the Black community will get no love and attention as well. And if you see the criminal justice system, that is also, again, another area that is not linked with the Asian community. But, delinquent youth should be tried in juvenile courts. But you'll see here that Asian and Latino youth have the highest rates of being tried in adult courts and not juvenile courts. But then once tried, actually is Black and Asian youth are the ones that are in prison at the highest rates. And so even on a workforce, you'll see that City of LA, Asian, we represent 12% of the population, but for the youth programs, for the Summer Hire LA program, Councilmember John, I want your attention to this. We're only getting 1.6%. Something is horribly wrong in terms of the city really servicing the Asian community. Even on death rates of May 2020, actually in LA County, Asians had the highest death rate. Obviously, the Black community is right next to it. But even at the national level, again, at recent data, Asians still have the second highest, but no one is lifting up this place. And even in terms of essential workers, 20% of all doctors in this country are Asian. 10% almost are nurses are Asian as well. And 1 out of 4 healthcare workers, again, are Asian. And you'll see that even in unemployment filings in New York, where it was the epicenter, Asians had the highest rate, 10,000%. The next group was 3,000% in terms of increase. And even recently, as of January, Asians still at the highest rates at 500%. And even with this Pew study, when people ask, who do you think faced the most racism? All communities said Asian was at the highest level. And yet, this is kind of the reality that we're slapped with every day, and I'm in so many rooms, even Ambassador Susan Rice, who's in charge of President Biden's policy in terms of infusing equity throughout. She says, look at COVID crisis, which disproportionately sicken and kill Black and brown people who are the frontline workers, the essential workers. Where is the Asian community? And I didn't even go over all the other slides that show that literally so many of the Asian community are in those essential businesses, not just healthcare, but retail and all the businesses that opened during this period. And so I just want to say, I'm going to end here, that this is the reality for the Asian community. And if we, as allies, please lift up these data points. Please understand, learn about our community, that again, to raise the question, where are the Asian community data points? Where are they in this room?
Jane, thanks so much for that, Hey Pin. And you really underlined with some data, qualitative thematics and narratives that we see in news. We certainly do. Jane, what stood out to you?
I mean, I think that what Hapin was suggesting and observing about the model minority myth, I mean, it really does play a big role in this story. I think historically, just folks have had a hard time taking anti-Asian racism and violence seriously, because the assumption was Asian Americans didn't really suffer from racism in the same way that other communities do. And it's important to acknowledge that racism has affected different racialized communities differently. That's extremely important to recognize, because meaningful solidarity has to recognize distinctiveness. You can't just flatten everyone's experiences. But in terms of Asian Americans, I think it's sobering that I think for many folks, it took videos of anti-Asian attacks, like the Asian American elders in San Francisco and Oakland and New York City. I think many people here have probably seen the 65-year-old Filipina walking in Midtown Manhattan, the security footage of her attack in the middle of the day on her way to church. So, Americans watch these videos and, they could no longer deny that, anti-Asian violence is actually happening and Asians do actually suffer from racism. But I think the model minority idea really is, I think, central to understanding kind of these misconceptions. And just to kind of build on what Hapin was sharing, earlier, the model minority, it obscures like the real struggles that Asian Americans face. So educational attainments, if you disaggregate, as Hapin suggested, educational attainment actually varies widely by group. And economic success, I saw a report that suggested Asian Americans are the most economically stratified racial community in America right now. The highest earning Asian Americans make 10 times more than the lowest earning Asian Americans. And in LA County, Koreans and Cambodians above the age of 65 are more likely than any other racial group to live below the poverty line. I'm sure the council member, Hapin, know these statistics very well. And so this idea of Asian Americans as successful, able to overcome racism or whatever discrimination exists through cultural traits like hard work, self-sufficiency, community education. This is a problematic assumption. And the final thing I'll just reiterate and elaborate is just, Hapin pointed out that the model minority pits Asian Americans against other racialized communities. And I think that's incredibly important to remember, because I'm a historian. Historians spend a lot of time reading archives, reading historical documents. And if you actually look at the articles about Asian Americans in the 1960s, it's really in the mid-60s, amid Black Power, amid the race riots of the mid-60s, in the wake of the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act of 1964, 1965, these articles about Japanese Americans and Chinese Americans and why they're so successful, like these become really popular in places like the New York Times, US News and World Report. The articles talk a lot about, again, about education and about cultural traits and behaviors that make Asian Americans, successful. But if you actually read the articles closely, the question that's really driving the analysis isn't just kind of how come these Asian Americans are so successful. The question that frames these articles is, why are Asian Americans so successful and why aren't Black communities also successful? So what about, Asian Americans, what can Black communities learn from? Like, what are the things that kind of the cultural practices that are holding Black communities back, right? So there is this tension, this kind of narrative built right into the model minority that allows different folks to take Asian Americans and use them and kind of, to make arguments against that in many ways pathologize and blame other racialized communities for their own apparent challenges. And I think that's something that I really hope folks will kind of unlearn and to try to kind of remember and to think about the ways in which, Asian Americans have also been targets of structural racism, historical racism. African Americans, Latinx Americans, racialized communities in this country, religious communities in this country have been targets of structural racism historically. So I think there is a lot more basis for solidarity than there is just for, this kind of competition among groups and allowing ourselves to be pitted against one another. So I think that's an important thing for us to remember, and that I hope folks will take away from this moment, that there's a lot of basis for solidarity.
And I just want to add that there's actually over 50 groups under the roof of AAPI. That's a lot of different countries, over 100 languages. And so again, even if it was true, we're not getting the benefits, but the fact is that the model minority image is a myth, and that really gives us double whammy again of being in no man's land.
All right, I'm going to get to questions and answers, and council member, if you can unmute, this one's for you. Thank you all who are asking questions. We have about 8 minutes for Q&A. And so I'd ask, I'll try to get to as many as you can. So go ahead and you put them in there if you're with us. We appreciate that. It says, council member, how, if at all, are you recovering a love for the Korean and or Korean American parts of your identity? And of course, you can react to what was said so far as well, council member.
Sure. No, what I was going to say with Jane, you don't need to go back that far to see our communities being pitted against each other. The 80s, the 90s, before the riots, after the riots. And it's just unfortunate that instead of focusing on, the issues that we both faced as minorities in this country, instead we were pitted against each other. And it's something that we need to learn from. That model minority thing is something that we see, people react to it like, why do you care? So people think you're good at math. What is the big deal? From my own personal experience, this is a very minor one, but in 8th grade, just having my teacher just constantly, question, like, I don't understand, John, why aren't you good at math? I don't understand why you don't get this. And, instead of getting the extra help I needed, for that math class, I was just pitted as being lazy. I'm just not trying hard enough. And, that's unfortunate. Or being, even when growing up in being in the workplace, you get the sense that you're being treated by people like, when they need you on your side, they feel like, oh, you can be manipulated. You're smaller in stature, and somehow, oh, I can get him. And you kind of explain them, like, are you having the same conversation with other people? Because when you're having the conversation with me, it's not so much about my opinion on this issue. It's about your opinion, and I should just agree with it. And that is some of what Hapen was talking about, of that of why we're not exceeding, going into that upper management, into the CEOs, of different companies, because of that, of how we are looked at that. And so I'm sorry, your question, Richard, was,
where's the stock market going to go? I'm joking. No, the question was asked from an anonymous attendee.
Mm-hmm.
How are you recovering a love for your heritage?
Well, I think that love of my heritage has always been there. I think just on the outside, begging my parents to just make me a peanut butter and jelly sandwich instead of, the little box lunches that they would make. But inside, I've always had that love. I love, celebrating the different things. I love, on my kids' first birthdays, even though my kids are biracial, that we still had what's called a dol, where, they pick their future, where they put a bunch of items in front of them, or that, on January 1st, that we all get together with our elders, and one by one, generation by generation, we bow to each other, wishing them prosperity in the new year, all those different things. I love, keeping those things, alive in my children. And it's really, I'm really proud when, when we see the difference of when I was growing up and someone opening up my refrigerator door and seeing a bottle of kimchi in there, thinking of like, oh my God, what's this science experiment that you have going into now, walking into my friends' homes and seeing that they have kimchi, and he eat it at a much larger rate than I do. I love that the fact that Korean food is now not only being accepted but very popular in today's communities and cultures.
Yeah, one thing on model minority, model means perfect. Model means good. So is there a good minority and a bad minority? Do we have bad minorities out there? And why would you say that? All minorities or all Americans are good, right? The construct of one against another, which affected above my pay grade here, Jane, so stick with me, but I'm going to still say it, is that the Italians went through it and the Irish went through it too. This idea of the new group being better than the others. And it is absolutely a farce. And we should not, when it was first coined in the 60s, right? It wasn't necessarily a new dynamic, but that was the word. We just happen to be the latest holders of that farce, of that fallacy. Let me get to another question here. We have 3 minutes, my friends. So please, if you can, move with dexterity. Linda Sands, what is being done to change laws that exclude Asians? Or, adding on to this here to our team, what is it that is sensitive to the Asian experience, right? What are the laws that are sensitive and inclusionary to stop the exclusionary parts of what the API community might be? Who wants to get into that one in 30 seconds?
Well, I've been working with the Jewish community and the Jewish Federation in terms of their advocacy to put curriculum, ethnic curriculum, into California schools. So that is definitely at least one area that can be helpful. Also, again, I think, I don't know so much a law, but we have advocated and successfully, we've heard Biden say it, to when he says Black, Brown, to include also Asian Pacific Americans. So those are a couple of minor victories that we've been part of.
Jane?
Yeah, and I should say, I mean, my first book is really all about how those exclusion laws were repealed. And I really just tie it to it's about US military intervention in Cold War Asia. So a lot of it's actually about geopolitics and foreign policy. So, I mean, those exclusion laws have been repealed in immigration and naturalization policy. But I mean, there are so many other areas. I think even what Haypin suggested earlier about the ways that many law enforcement officials in Georgia responded to the Atlanta shootings, this idea, this misguided idea that Asians can't be the victims of hate crimes and that, federal hate crime doesn't for some reason apply to Asian Americans. So I think you see a lot of movement around those kinds of questions. And I know recently there was an update right on that case with the shooter in Atlanta, which I was glad to see. So I think there are other areas now in terms of pursuing full inclusion and equality for Asian Americans, right? The challenges look different now, but I think the activism and the fight are ongoing.
Yeah, looking forward, Jane. Haypin?
Oh, I do want to add that around affirmative action, that for many Asians, as you saw in the promotion probability, that we need mentorship. So affirmative action should be looking at also beyond just college, but really, college admission, but also, again, in the workplace as well.
Yeah, and specific to the point of hate crimes in Georgia, you're right. Our team spoke with the district attorney from Fulton County today. We were there on the ground with the breaking story yesterday, myself and my team. And the very question that the family, for instance, from Young Yu and her son, as well as the other, I spoke with Randy Park. And he also one of the survivors of another one of the families. Their question was, how can you not associate both their gender and race at the same time? And their push to that DA was, do not deny them any part of who they are, and do not focus on gender alone, which is specifically a dynamic that affects this community, our community. And that's a nuance, right? That we must talk about more. And it's because of these family members talking to the DA that this specific hate crime includes both gender as well as race. We will see what happens, but that was an important move forward. final thoughts from all three of you, if you can. We'll start with the council member. Hey, okay. I tell you what, Mr. Council Member, we're gonna, as you figure out the mute, not mute, or if you've got a marching band moving around you right now, we'll get around that. Hey, Pin, 30 seconds to you, my friend.
I just want to say a big thank you to the Jewish Federation. I think that there are, the Jewish community also faces sometimes that model minority myth where, you know, all Jewish community are rich, and yet actually the Jewish community have been actually one of the biggest targets of victims of, you know, hate crime. And so I think that there's some great places for solidarity. So I look forward to that. Thank you for the friendship and the opportunity to hear us as a community.
Jane, 30 seconds. I'm going to wait for that marching band to move past Councilmember John's house.
I mean, I echo what Haypen shared. I think, right, solidarity is really where we need to go. And I've been thinking a lot lately about the phrase, none of us are free until all of us are free, which is, I've been told, a modern paraphrase of a quote by the 19th century Jewish American poet, Emma Lazarus. And it's something I'm thinking a lot about lately, because I think it's really about a broad mindset shift that, you know, where we could all see our futures, our freedoms as entangled, right? That fighting for one community is fighting for all communities, and thinking of ourselves as part of this broader we.
I'm sorry about that, Richard. You know, in my district office. First of all, thank you very much for having me as part of this panel. You know, I just want to leave by saying I really think one of the positive things that has come out of this is working with other Asian groups, Asian communities, I should say, and understanding that a lot of our experiences are very, very, very similar. But what I've appreciated, like I said earlier, I represent a district that is not predominantly Asian. And I love the fact that there are so many people that are from different communities kind of having that conversation now and really kind of seeing, like, you know, John, tell me, what is a term? What am I using? And they're willing to discuss that. And I ask everyone, you know, when something is meant as hate towards you, but I also need people to recognize when it's sometimes just ignorance or just not understanding, and to take that time as a teachable moment to have, instead of just lashing out and screaming at the person because they say something that maybe offends you. If you know it's not coming from that place of hate, take the time to talk to them and explain to them why that term or why that way of thinking may be offensive. I've learned that has been for me, just a much more positive outcome. There's just too much screaming and yelling going on these days, and we just need more talking.
And more learning.
Absolutely.
Google Hollaback and the 5 Ds. Get that muscle set moving on how to be a great bystander and upstander. Hollaback 5 Ds. I'm gonna holla at Elisa. Elisa, close us out, and thanks for having us all.
Thanks so much, Richard. And thank you all to our speakers, to Haypen, to Jane, to Councilmember Lee, and to you, Richard, for moderating a fascinating conversation. I think if there's so many takeaways, but I think one of the important takeaways is that we actually have so much more to learn and so much more to discuss and so much more work to do to uplift each other's voices. So I hope that in some combination of all of you and your colleagues, that we can do this conversation again and dive deeper and learn more together. So I look forward to standing beside you and advocating with you and uplifting your voices. And I know the Jewish community feels the same way about having you as allies. So thank you very much. And I wish everyone a very safe and very happy spring and summer.
Thank you.
Thank you.